They came to St. Lucia, and in St. Lucia at the time, in the airport, there were big signs. It's $5,000 if you attempt to buy or smuggle a parrot. It's a year's hard labour. And so they said to the customs official, this is a bit strange. 20 miles away, we just came from an island of St. Vincent and we were offered parrots on the street. We walked straight into the airport here in St. Lucia, 20 miles to the north, and we're harangued with threats to go to jail if we even look at a parrot.
Were they supposed? Were the parrots already protected?
Yes, that was part of. Yes.
Yeah.
So these were all our materials that were in the airport, and they kind of found it strange. 2 parrots, 20 miles apart, one seemingly unprotected, and one seemingly very vigorously protected. So they asked the customs officer, I see the posters in the airport. What's all of this about the parrot, and the customs officer says, oh yeah, nobody touches our parrot, this is ours, and you'd be very careful messing around with our parrot if you're interested in it. And they were they were somewhat amused, but also bemused as to why there was the difference. And so they said, oh, who's running that program? And the customs officer said, forestry, forestry, go by forestry. And actually it gets even more amusing because did you want me to continue with the story?
Certainly.
So it gets even more amusing. So they went off to a hotel called Untitled, which is down the west coast. And I actually got a phone call. I got a phone call in my office from the same customs officer. And he said, oh, Paul, be very careful. There's some people asking a lot of funny questions about parrots. And just be careful, because I know what they keep asking. They're asking lots of things, And so we kind of got word down to Untitled that if these people were asking about parrots, be very, very careful. And so they were down there and they wanted to go and see a parrot, and they would ask the manager, where are the parrots? And the manager would tell them the wrong direction,
Right.
Anyhow, eventually they came up to my office in Castries and they said, we're interested, perhaps we're from Rare. And it was then the thing clicked and they said, it's really funny, everyone seems to know about the parrot, but nobody knows where they are.
Right.
So it was kind of funny. And at that point they asked me and they said, we're with a small conservation organisation, it's sort of being relaunched. We have a little bit of money in the bank. I think at that time it was $100,000 they had in the bank. And what would it take for me to work with Rare to replicate the program we did on St. Lucia in St. Vincent, the island they'd just come from?
Right.
Would it be possible? Would I be interested in doing it? And so I said, sure, I'd be interested in doing it. I knew the forestry guys down there. And so I went and worked with the forestry department in St. Vincent, who are incredible people. And they just didn't have the resources. It wasn't a lack of interest on their part. So I spent a year in St. Vincent.
So it was, even at that time, you knew that what you had done was going to be replicable.
I didn't know it was going to be replicable, but I saw no reason why it shouldn't be. St. Vincent is 20 miles to the south. It's a mirror image of St. Lucia, essentially. It has an endemic parrot, very similar, little bit smaller population. I thought it was worth a try.
Yeah. And so after that, after you yourself had, you did that second campaign.
Yes.
After that, did you start recruiting people?
No. No. So the next step was, I spent a year in St. Vincent, and we ran the campaign in a year, essentially. And then Rare said to me, at that time I was on contract, I wasn't on full-time employment. Then Rare said to me, well, would I go to the island to the north of St. Lucia, which is called Dominica, which has 2 species of endemic parrots, and basically replicate what I had done on St. Vincent with St. Vincent Forestry Division on Dominica. And so I went to Dominica for a year, worked with their forestry department, and again, fantastic stuff. It's not Paul did this, it's Paul working with
Certainly.
the forestry departments. And then at the end of that year, they said, well, would we go to another island called Montserrat, where they didn't have a parrot, but they had an oriole. And I said, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense, because if I keep going there, then there's no sustainability. What happens when I leave? And that really what we should be doing was working with wholly with local people. The local people implement the project, and maybe I would just advise it. And so I said, well, what we could do is we could write a manual, like a cookery book, and it's called Promoting Protection Through Pride. And we could give this manual to what would effectively become the campaign managers, and then I would visit them 4 or 5 times a year.
Right.
To provide guidance. In those days we didn't have the internet, we
Yeah,
didn't
yeah,
have all of this paraphernalia. And so that's actually what happened. So Montserrat, with Rose Willock, who was with the Montserrat National Trust, she became in effect the first independent campaign manager that Rare worked with. And I joined Rare at that point full-time. Well, not contract, full-time, not contract. And that was the approach that we used for subsequently about 30-odd campaigns. We would give them the manual, and I would visit them 4 or 5 times a year, each time for a week, to provide guidance.
What regions were you working in at the time?
The initial campaigns, what we call traditional campaigns, those were the first 20, 30 of them, were in the Eastern Caribbean. So we would include Trinidad, Tobago, Grenada, St. Vincent, Dominica, as well as the Northern Caribbean, Bahamas, Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos. And we moved across into Central America, so we ran some early campaigns, traditional campaigns in Belize, Costa Rica, Yucatan of Mexico. And then we moved into the Pacific, so Palau, Western Samoa, and Fiji.
Yeah. Was this something that did the organizations in these countries, like in the South Pacific, did they hear about you, or were you actively going out and searching out sort of similar species, things, threats to these species that you thought that you could help, or did they seek you out?
It was a combination. So often as we moved through the Caribbean, because of my time in forestry, you tended to know most of the people in the Caribbean. So then it was quite easy. It was like, well, we'll just go to the next island. And a combination of people asking us or us knowing. When we sort of ran out of islands in the Caribbean, we moved to Belize because we kind of said, well, look, Belize in very many ways is like a Caribbean island because it's a very small population, basically the same population size as St. Lucia, and it's surrounded by not sea in all cases, but other cultures, the Guatemala and Spanish-speaking countries, Mexico. So we said, why don't we try it? Yes, a mainland country. It's bigger by number of square miles, but it has many of the similarities of a small Caribbean island. And so we worked on Belize. We found a fantastic campaign manager, a guy called Rafael Manzanero, who subsequently came to work for Rare for many, many years. When it came to the Pacific, the board at that time said, well, what do you think, Paul? Where could this work again? And I'd never been to the Pacific. And I said, well, look, I don't see why we couldn't try this on another island nation. Very similar threats, very similar problems, very similar population sizes. They just happen to be half a world away. So I did a reconnaissance visit to the Pacific, and I visited 5 islands. I visited Tonga, Fiji, Samoa, Cook Islands. And we just talked to the people. We said, this is what's worked in St. Lucia. I'm St. Lucian national as well as English, and so I could speak in a sense from working with the government. So I was talking government to government, and I could say, well, I was with forestry. And they all seemed interested, but Western Samoa seemed particularly interested, and they said, well, let's try it. What's the harm in trying it? And so we ran the first campaign in Western Samoa, and then we moved from there. The same thing. The people in Western Samoa knew the people in Fiji, and we just continued.
Yeah. So even in these early campaigns, were you specifically applying like the notion of social marketing? Was that sort of like a known entity at the time, or were you just? Yeah.
So I think the best, if you'd have to go back to my time, we'd have to go retrospectively back to my time when I was working with the forestry department. So before all these campaigns in the rest of the region.
Pre-1987.
Yes, exactly. I went to St. Lucia in 1977 as a scientist, but I'd studied psychology as well. And basically, we tried all the, let's say, the normal outreach. So we would go to a community and we would talk about the thousands of tons of soil that's going on the reef and erosion, and people would fall asleep, and we'd design posters that would be boring and nobody would put them up. And so we really just sat in forestry one day and said, why is it so difficult? What we're trying to promote is things that will make people's lives better. If they have less deforestation, they will have less erosion. Less erosion means more water. More water means better crops, more possible water to drink. Why is it so difficult? And we basically said, look, hang on a second. marketing every day. They're selling cigarettes. Cigarettes, they don't only kill you, they say on the packet it's going to kill you, and they still sell them. Perfume from the anal gland of a deer, they can sell it.
Right.
What are these guys doing?
There's a famous quote by you, by the way, that if they can use a sexy woman to sell beer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, basically, so look at it. Well, the cigarette company does not tell you what's in the cigarette. It doesn't say it's got this and that, and the perfume doesn't say it's made from the anal gland of a deer. They don't tell you what's in the product. They basically sell it to you, as you said, around using, the Marlboro guy on the back of the horse. It's an image. You're buying an image. You're not really buying the cigarette. You're buying the image of, macho. And so we said, well, look, why should we spend all day long saying a parrot lays 2 white eggs, and why don't we simply use the same techniques? So instead of talking about the parrot as a biological symbol, let's talk about the parrot as a national symbol. We've just become independent. Let's create an aura around this species as something that appeals. It's ours. America doesn't have this bird. America can land on the moon, sure. But they can never have a St. Lucian parrot. It's ours. It's symbolic. And pride, you don't have to be rich, you don't have to be white, you don't have to be, Jewish or Christian. Pride is something that is there, and think about it. The flag, the English flag, is made of the same material as my underwear, one I pull up and one I stand up for. It's essentially the same. Pride is a very powerful emotion. And so we said, well, let's try it, and that's how it began. Now, did we know it was social marketing? No.
Yeah.
No, we didn't. Did we know that we were emulating marketing and trying to hone in on who were the key audiences and what would drive the audiences to make behaviour change? This aspect of pride, of understanding the benefits that would accrue. We knew that, but we didn't know it was social marketing.
So basically it was
trial and error.
It went from maybe environmental education, like you said,
Yes.
making the posters with the
Don't
state,
do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
Yes, and it proved to be very, very powerful. Laws were changed, reserves were set aside, people became very, very supportive of the cause, and so it developed in that sort of trial and error, really, just and constantly refining and constantly modifying the approach to such a time that we could really package it quite well.
And as you started packaging this, at what point did you partner with the first university?
Yeah. So in the late 1990s, we looked back at the 30-odd campaigns that we had, what now becomes known as traditional campaigns. We said, well, looking at the results, looking at the way we run it, the process, how could we improve it? We found a number of issues. First of all, it wasn't scalable, because I was visiting, or Raphael, who we took on, was visiting each site 5 times. So that meant I was visiting in a single year 5 times to Fiji, 5 times to the Bahamas, 5 times to Belize. It's a lot of miles, a lot of time. So the first thing was it didn't appear to be scalable. The second thing was that the campaign managers never learnt from one another, because you'd be running a campaign in Fiji and they would see me, and you'd be running a campaign in Belize and they would see me, but they wouldn't see each other. So there was no cross-learning, and yet they were all running the same kind of campaigns. So the second thing was they weren't learning from one another, and that's not particularly healthy. And again, in those days there wasn't the internet and the email, still in its early days. The third thing was that these campaign managers were working very, very hard. It's very hard work being a campaign manager, and they didn't get any more money for their hard work because they're not employed by RARE. Our campaign managers are employed by their local organisation. So they could work 5 times as hard in the year they were running the Pride campaign, but they didn't get 1 cent more money. So this was another consideration. And then also, the campaign managers came from those very early campaigns, came in 3 groups. They were either forest officers, they were forest officers when they came to us. These people knew a lot about forestry, but they didn't know much necessarily about outreach or about learning theory or about how adults learn. Or sometimes they were teachers who came to us with a teaching or an outreach background, but often didn't know a lot about biology. Or sometimes they knew about neither. They were just the outreach officer. So what we say is, well, looking at all of these different problems, how might we be able to resolve them? So what we said is, well, look, if we brought them to a university, the first thing is, if we had them at a university for a period of time, we could train them. We wouldn't perhaps have to see them 5 times during the year. Maybe we could see them twice during the year, because we could train them up front, take a lot of time up front. Secondly, if they came to a university, they would be living together, and they would therefore become friends with one another and shared experiences. So when they did get back into the field, they would keep in touch, even if it was difficult to keep in touch, because they weren't forced to do it. They did it because they built this camaraderie. We're all in it together.
They're a class.
They're a class. They're a class. Thirdly, by bringing them to a university, we could teach them. We could bring them all up to somewhat like the same level. So those who had a strong biological background, we could up their knowledge of outreach and social marketing. Those who came with good outreach, we could up the biological. So the concept was that in that first university phase, we could teach them the theories that they would need to run the program. And finally, if they came to a university, then we could offer them credits. At that time, it was a diploma. So they would actually get a reward. If they ran a good campaign and passed all the assignments, they would actually get a certificate, a diploma from a recognised university, which they could use to promote themselves within their own jobs. Because in many of these societies where we work, you're promoted not always on your ability, very often on the academic qualifications you have. And many times they didn't have academic qualifications. So we said, well, why don't we partner with the University of Kent? And that's what we did. And so we ran what became known as Pride 1.0 campaigns, using this model of 2 university phases, one at the beginning and one at the end, and teaching them 7 modules, 6 modules in the first program and then 1 at the end. And we started in England with English speaking, and very quickly realised that if we only taught in English, we'd be limiting a very large percentage of the globe. So very quickly thereafter, we joined forces with University of Guadalajara in Mexico, where we could teach the same course, but in Spanish. And that happened in England, happened in the year 2000, 2001, and Guadalajara in 2003.
And then additionally now there is the university in Bogor.
Yep.
What year did Bogor happen?
So Bogor, I can't remember the exact year, but it probably happened, I'd have to look, but it happened, say, 3 years ago. And that was sort of the end of we did run a couple of cohorts out of there with the 1.0 model. But then we looked back, because by that time we'd run about 100 campaigns. Yeah. And so we looked back, and again we reflected and said, well, how can we improve the program, moving it to the next stage? And we realised that a couple of things needed to happen. We need to integrate barrier removal. Barrier removal means it's one thing to persuade you, to use an analogy, it's one thing to persuade you that riding a bicycle is a good idea. It's one thing to get you to want to ride a bicycle. But if there are no bicycles available, they don't exist, or you can't afford a bicycle, all that's going to happen is you're going to feel guilty not using it. So we realised that to become more effective, we had to integrate what we call barrier removal. In other words, get rid of the barrier that stops you from converting knowledge and attitude into behaviour. And also we realised that we wanted to have the campaign managers come back after doing their project plan, because the project plan is very complex. So rather than having 2 university phases, we wanted 3 university phases. We wanted to tweak the curriculum to make it more pertinent, having run 100 campaigns, to make it more useful and pertinent to the campaign managers in the regions. And so that's how we ended up changing the curriculum, changing the process, and bringing on our 4th university, which was the University Southwest University in China, Kunming. What we also realised was that we wanted to keep the curriculum agile. We wanted to be able to have the curriculum customised. So one year we could work on, let's say, dynamite fishing. The next year we could work on bushmeat, and the year after on deforestation of upper watersheds. The way it was structured was that each individual university validated us, in other words, approved the course. And if you were trying to make changes quickly, having to get 4 universities to change and approve the changed curriculum is very complicated. So what we said is we really need one overarching university, one university that will validate wherever we teach. so that we only had to go to one university to make changes, and those changes were filtered down to the 4.
So the 4 would agree with this one choice that you made.
Exactly. And so we did 2 things. We moved the English-speaking university from the University of Kent in England to Georgetown University in Washington here, and we partnered with the University of Texas in El Paso, UTEP, to offer us that global accreditation. So now you could be an Indonesian taking the Pride program in Bogor, Indonesia, but if you are successful, you will come out with a Master's in Communications from UTEP. Even though you have never been to UTEP, you would still come out. It makes it, and I'm very appreciative of UTEP's kindness and willingness to help us, it makes it a lot easier to have an agile curriculum that you can teach worldwide. And our dream is to add universities. Francophone university, so we can teach this program in French, and a potentially Brazilian university, so we can teach it in Portuguese.
So, in addition to the methodology that you've developed over the years, just the curriculum, so to speak, the sort of program has developed into this. Yes. This state where now they get a master's degree. They are accredited master's degree in social marketing.
Yes, it's called Masters in Communication.
Masters in Communication.
Yes. But in reality, that's the name of the course, but it's so much more. They learn project planning, they learn marketing, they learn communication, they learn conflict negotiation, they learn project evaluation. It's a very comprehensive program, very intense program, and not easy.
Right.
You ask any campaign manager, it's not a cakewalk. It's really hard work, very, very committed, and only the best campaign managers will really succeed.
And basically, you've already gone through all this. I mean, you've done. You were running your own campaigns at one time.
Yes, and I've had the pleasure of meeting many of the campaigns and visiting the campaigns. But the campaign that I ran in St. Lucia, in let's say from 77 to 87, is very, very different in many ways to the campaigns that we run now. There are still some things that are similar.
Yeah.
And it's grown out of it.
Give me an example of like what you did back in St. Lucia that is still carried on today.
Well, most of our campaigns, in fact, all of our campaigns up to today, use the concept of a flagship species, use a messenger. And so all the campaigns, the first one was with a St. Lucian parrot, a St. Vincent parrot. Even to this day, our campaigns are still using species, individual species, to help carry the message. So that's still the same.
If I can interrupt here for a second, when a campaign starts, is the species that they pick, is it necessarily an endangered species,
right.
or could they just the campaign is based on a threat like deforestation,
right.
or overfishing, and they would just pick a species that is native to that area?
Yeah, it's a combination, and a lot of that is dependent on the agencies we work with, the campaign managers, and the advice of our own staff. So it doesn't have to be an endemic species. So if you take, for example, the first campaign we ran in Palau, we ran with a Palau fruit dove. That's actually one of the commonest birds on Palau, but it is only found there, and it's symbolic of the habitat that we were working in. So sometimes we're working with an endangered species, sometimes not an endangered species, sometimes with an endemic, it's only found there, but not always. So when we've worked with turtles aren't only found in St. Lucia, the green turtle is found in multiple countries. What I would say is that it would be very, very hard to work with a malaria mosquito or a slug or something like that. Not impossible, but very, very difficult. So,
has it ever been done?
We've worked with an iguana,
right.
in Turks and Caicos, which isn't the most attractive species, but it was that type of iguana was only found on Turks and Caicos. And in fact, our campaign manager very cleverly actually used the slogan, "Look who you're calling ugly." So when you saw the badge or the button, you saw the picture of the iguana. So there's ways of getting around it by catchy slogans and catchy materials. Often the species we use is decided in collaboration with the community. So we do quite a lot of research, and one of the questions in the questionnaire survey is, what species do you think best represents our community, our island, our region? And sometimes it might be a species that, for example, fishermen very often follow the birds who help them to find the fish. So it could be some cultural symbol, as well as being endemic or endangered. So it varies.
Now, when these and this is something that has carried on from the time you started till now, and at this point, the species that is picked is also, it's used in a number of different ways. It's used in to sort of say, like, this is our, this is a symbol of our region, but it's also used with the mascots.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about how that started?
Well, it's the same thing. Think of Smokey the Bear. If you're an American, think of Smokey the Bear. You know, the bear is symbolic of the forest habitat, and it's symbolic of the fact that if you have forest fires, you know, the old bear gets singed and potentially dies. So it's the same thing. We're using the species as a symbol for that habitat, as a messenger. It's non-political, non-threatening. It's not a boring old politician standing in front of you. It can be made very charismatic, especially for young people. Costumes, think Mickey Mouse, think Donald Duck, think any of these ones. And particularly when you're working with rural communities that may never have been, and especially young people when they've never been exposed, I mean, they know what Mickey Mouse is, but they never had any chance to go to Disney World. You know, having a big mascot come to your school, it's not only exciting for the kids, because a lot of people say, well, yeah, but the mascots go to the kids, but what have the kids got to do with deforestation? The kids are a portal, they're a window to their parents. So the kids run home, Daddy, 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 I saw a 6-foot parrot came to my school today and gave me a badge. You know, the father goes, because this isn't the norm in those places. They don't have Mickey Mouse. You know, you've been smoking marijuana or something? No. It told me this. Right. And, you know, a kid tells the parents, they can't help but listen. You know, the kid is so excited. And it taught us a song. And you know what it told us, Dad? It told us that if we don't stop the cutting of the forest, the water will come brown from the tap. You know, and it's a portal, it's a window on it. Yeah. Also, you know, people say, well, only mascots are great for kids. But we've had the mayor in Oxapampa kissing the mascot. We've had the mayor opening, the mascot opening things. You know? Right. So, and driving down the road in the back of a pickup truck, and adults as well as kids chasing after the pickup truck. Right. So, yes, so we use mascots, we use puppets, but we also use posters and billboards and comic books and leaflets and handouts and T-shirts and art competitions and sermons. You know, it's a plethora. Radio shows, TV. It's a plethora of materials. And it's whatever materials we think is most likely to reach whatever the target audience is. So clearly, if the target audience is a group of illiterate farmers, we're not going to produce a 50-page written handbook. It doesn't work. But if, for example, it's a bunch of young people throwing litter, then what better than a reggae song by a famous reggae star? It's going to reach them. And they're going to look at it in the same way as you have Michael Jordan selling Wheaties. I don't know if Michael Jordan eats Wheaties or not, but you use Michael Jordan because the audience you want to reach holds Michael Jordan, or Tiger Woods, needless to say, in high esteem, and the link between the two. So this is the philosophy of the program, and using charismatic species as spokespersons or spokes-animals we found to be very useful.
It's almost making the species into a superstar.
It is. And if you come from a rural community where you don't believe that anybody sees you or holds you in high esteem because you're poor, you're impoverished, you have never been given an opportunity to the outside world, everybody has browbeaten you from the time because you're a poor village. If you're told you have something that nobody else has, nobody. Don't worry about the rich person in the city down there, they don't have it. It's only found. This is very empowering. Very empowering to know that you have something that is important. And I won't name which island, but I was on an extremely small island in Indonesia some years ago. Very, very small, one that nobody here, perhaps even many Indonesians, wouldn't have heard of. And I was sitting with the local camat, the local mayor, and I said to him, through a translator, I said to him, you know, this island has 3 birds that's found nowhere else in Indonesia, nowhere else in the world. And he couldn't believe it. He totally couldn't believe it. And he made me show him a picture of them. 2 of them were pretty ugly, and 1 of them was pretty spectacular. But he got so excited, he called the imam being the religious leader. He called the imam. He had the imam come into the office, and he said, essentially, you know, praise be to Allah, we've been given 3 species that nobody else has on any other island in Indonesia. It's a very small island I'm talking about. Right. And so the imam called people to pray
Yeah.
To tell them
Yeah.
that this was very, very, very special. This is what I mean. It's important when you have something that's unique. It brings something to you in the same way as when your football team wins against, when some obscure team wins against Manchester United or something. It's a feeling you feel good.
Yes.
You feel a sense of pride.
Yes.
And that's really what underpins the program from day one. Pride is a feeling that motivates people, that is empowering.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that you mentioned that. We just were working on a story about Elizabeth Cabrera, who when she went to her site, and she started showing them the picture of the species. They also, what is that?
Exactly.
What is that? And then she would tell them, this is ours.
Yeah.
This is it. This is ours. This is ours.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
And she had, I think, 100 volunteers on motorbikes distributing questionnaire surveys the next week.
Quite an amazing story.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, people want to feel that they have something special, and we see that every day. We see that in our love of sports, where one team, we weren't, when we were born, we didn't pop out of our mother's womb shouting Manchester United, right? Nor saying the national anthem, nor any of these other things, and yet they become quite important for people.
Right.
Indeed, wars are fought over these things,
Certainly.
right?
Certainly. When did, as far as bringing in the universities, when did we start bringing in partners? Or when did partner organizations such as the Nature Conservancy or Conservation International, did they start approaching RARE to help with their projects?
We've always worked in partnerships because, as I said, we've never employed, or very, very, very rarely employed, our campaign managers directly. We've always worked in partnership, usually with what we call lead agencies. That would be the Forestry Department of St. Lucia or the Bahamas National Trust. And very, very often, even in the early days, those organisations were supported in one way or another by a bigger organisation. I guess, and I couldn't guarantee this, but I would guess one of the very earliest was when the Nature Conservancy, who was working with the Palau Conservation Society, a guy called Chuck Cook, we were running the first campaign in the Pacific in Western Samoa, and he called me and said, would we work in Palau? And I'd never heard of Palau. I had no idea on the map where it was. And I sort of said, well, I don't even know where it is, much less.
Yeah.
And he took me. He asked me to come to Palau. And I'm pretty sure that would be the first case of, let's say, where they approached us independently and said, we've heard, as a thing. But if you go back to the very, very earliest days, as I said, I was working in St. Lucia, and RARE came and said that. And World at that time, RARE was affiliated with World Wildlife Fund.
Okay.
So I think you could say almost from our inception, we've been working in partnership with other organisations. We can't do it alone.
Yeah.
We're not. Two hands make more noise than one.
Certainly, yeah. So tell me, what would you say was your most interesting campaign?
Jesus. Oh, I don't know. Everyone's interesting.
What's your most memorable campaign?
No, there's always moments. I liked. Obviously, the ones that mean the most to me are the ones that I was the most involved in. That doesn't mean they were the best campaigns or the most exciting campaigns. It's just I was closer to them because I went there 4 or 5 times. So I always liked the campaign in the Bahamas, the first campaign we did in the Bahamas with the Bahama National Trust, and what was then, she was then called Monique Clark, and now Monique Sweeting and Gary Larson and that team. I always liked that one a lot. I think they did a really good job. The video they did, the music video, I still think is the best that we've ever done on the Bahama Parrot. I was very proud of Rafael Manzanero in Belize, because Belize is a huge country compared to all the Caribbean. In the context of the world, it's a tiny country, but in the context of everything we'd done up to that point, it was a very big country. And he went into every community, every single school. He did 20,000 miles driving in a year. And so that one meant a lot. But in all honesty, you could pick many of the campaigns as having highlights. One did a better song than the other. One did a better poster. One did a better costume. One did a better... And it just becomes it's hard. You can't pick one. Listening to... I wasn't very close to Elizabeth. You mentioned Elizabeth's campaign, because that wasn't when I was monitoring campaigns. So I didn't go there. I haven't seen it. But when she gave a presentation at Rare's board meeting the other day, I was crying. I was crying.
I think one of the more interesting thing about Elizabeth's campaign, or just her as a campaign manager, and what's going on now with the campaign managers, is they're going out and being able to take what they've learned at Rare, and they go to their own sites independently, and they will go and spread this methodology of Pride.
And that's happened from the very earliest days. If you take Belize has run 3, 4. They're running a campaign right now without any assistance from us. Same in St. Lucia. They ran a white-breasted thrasher campaign. They ran an iguana campaign. I mean, yes, of course, that's the idea. The idea is that you teach a man to fish and they can fish, right? It doesn't happen in every case. Sometimes the campaign managers leave and move for other organisations. There's a whole bell curve. But of course our desire is not that it happens once and never again, but that the campaign that we work on continues, and that it spins off either other full campaigns or aspects of campaigns. That's the dream.
Yeah. So is this still a 24-hour day job for you?
It's not 24, it's more like 16 nowadays. But it's not work. It's not work.
Yeah.
It's pleasure. It's a pleasure. And, the heroes of this, of course, Rare plays a role, but the heroes really are these campaign managers. If they're willing to work hard, if they're willing to have faith, and if they have a great lead agency behind them, the local organisation, really they can achieve really, really, really significant impacts. Now, if the lead agency is not supportive, if the campaign manager isn't bought into the process or isn't willing to work hard, the success is proportionately less. But I've been at Rare for 22 years plus, and I've seen campaigns in every corner of the world. Indonesia, China, Latin America, Africa, where if you have the right mix of dedicated campaign manager and good lead agency, well-resourced, doesn't matter if you're black, white, pink, yellow, Christian, Muslim, rich, poor, you can have a really good campaign, but it takes hard work and commitment, just as anything does in this world. Nothing is for free.
You had mentioned that the campaign, the training time,
yes,
the time of 2 years.
Yes.
Do you see that that most campaigns achieve, like if they want to decrease overfishing or
sure,
stop deforestation or
sure,
preserve some wetlands? Do you find that this happens in 2 years, or
right,
does it take longer?
Yeah, and I would say that 2 years is really an artificial timeline. We have to put a sort of a check-in point for as Rare, because we can't commit to an unending timeline. But the people we work with shouldn't see them as 2-year campaigns. They should see them as a campaign until success is reached. Now, we may not be along the road with them all the way. It's a long journey. What we want is to get them started on that journey and to get them feeling comfortable walking that path, Now, some have success in 2 years, some have success before the campaign. Depends a lot on the threat, depends a lot on where the community is in the behaviour change continuum as to how close they are to adopting a new thing. Obviously, changing someone's behaviour around, let's say, solid waste, putting garbage in a bin, is a hell of a lot easier than changing it around dynamite fishing when people have no other alternative. So I think you see a spectrum. I would argue that in many complex behaviours, 2 years you are not going to see even the behaviour itself changing, much less a rebounding of a population that might be very slow growing. But we don't see campaigns as 2 years other than it's a check-in. So we have a follow-up grant programme. Those campaigns that we believe warrant it, we try to provide follow-up grants. We keep them going. But it is a check-in. You have to at some stage check in on, just as you do with your daughter at school, you don't wait from year 1 to year 13 before you check in. We've chosen 2 years as we believe an appropriate place, and we can look at the campaign and see how we can help best.
So Rare's, it appears that, and just I'll edit this out. I'm talking as if I don't know anything.
Of course, yeah,
so,
no problem.
But it appears that Rare's role in a threat in a certain region, say if it was deforestation, there might be the agency in that country would say, or somebody in that agency would say, we've got a real problem here. And or perhaps a scientist that works for World Wildlife Fund might say, you know what, the species is dying.
Right.
I know the science behind this. I know how to tell.
Yes.
Rare's role
Right.
is to help change the population or
Right.
the community's
Right.
attitude
Right.
to help the scientist stop.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, the Pride program is a tool in a toolbox. It's like having a hammer, right? A hammer, you can't cut a piece of wood. You can smash it to bits, but you can't cut it. You need a saw for that. And so, exactly. So, where we work best is where we can complement those other tools. So, a scientist may have come up with a threat, and another organisation may have come up with a solution to that threat. So let's say, for example, clearing of firewood is the threat. Another organisation may have come up with a solution, a different kind of stove that requires that if they use it, they use less fuel wood. Our niche is to convince the community why they would want to give up their 3-stone stove that they've been using for millennia or hundreds and hundreds of years, why they should adopt the new kind of stove, not just because it saves the forest, but it also saves them time. They don't have to walk for 5 hours to collect firewood. The smoke in the house is less, so there's less chance of getting cataracts. So our job is to create an enabling environment for this other complementary activities to take place. Now, sometimes there aren't the complementary partners, and we have to assume the role of also helping with the barrier removal. But the ideal situation is where we come together as a group of concerned conservation organisations and bring our various tool sets together so that you have a toolbox. Now, if you have a toolbox that has a saw, a drill, a hammer, and all the other paraphernalia, you can build yourself a house. And that's the ideal situation. And that's why we like to partner with our colleagues in World Wildlife Fund, CI, WCS. WCS has the fantastic scientists. By working in tandem with them in time and place, we can have a much greater chance of success.
Yeah, because when it comes down to it, most of the time it would seem that the community or humans are the cause. Always. So you're not going to change the problem without...
Short of a volcano erupting and spilling down and destroying a piece of forest, you name any other environmental threat, or or a tsunami or something, you name virtually any other environmental threat, you go far enough back, man is at the cause of it. So, deforestation, people are clearing it for timber or for fuel wood, pollution on the reef, well, somebody is chucking herbicide, weedicide, fertilizer into the river. So in the end, people are the cause of many of the problems, and people are the solution, because they are. And every action ends up as one individual, whether it's one individual taking the decision to build a solid waste garbage dump on the side of a river. It's an individual decision. It could be one person dumping the garbage or one person taking the decision to build the thing there. And so we have to reach out to individuals. Now, of course, individuals bound together become communities, and we work in communities, but we're trying to target individual behaviour change, whatever that change is. So one of our campaigns might focus on the farmers on top of the hill, trying to persuade them to accept some kind of reciprocal agreement, some kind of subsidy to not clear a piece of their land. But similarly, we've got to work downstream and work with the communities to perhaps create some kind of fee system and an acceptance of paying, however modest the fee is, to help compensate for not clearing upstream. We may have to work with individual fishers to adopt a new kind of fishing technique, but we also have to work with the community leaders to create a social norm so that the rest of the community, when they see someone dynamite fishing, saying, not in my backyard.
Right.
Yeah. And so, yes, it's a matter of segmenting your audience, identifying what behaviour needs changing, trying to come up with a strategy of providing an alternative behaviour that's socially acceptable, economically viable, easily adoptable, and putting those in place simultaneously with a campaign. It's like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that we have all the pieces, doesn't mean we can provide all the pieces, but when all the pieces are there and they fit together, we can get some success.
Would it be fair to say that RARE focuses on the human side
Yes.
of the conservation
Yes.
challenge?
We're a behaviour change organisation, and behaviour change with two goals in mind. Behaviour change to reduce threats, and the reduction of threats to achieve biodiversity conservation. So behaviour change is a step in a process that leads to conservation results. It's not always linear, it's certainly not always easy, and it's certainly not always in a short-term timeline. But that's our desire. Our desire is to go from knowledge right the way through to conservation results, step by step by step. And in some cases and in some campaigns, in 2 years you can only move people from knowledge through to beginning to think about whatever that behaviour change takes place, because it really is a continuum. And in others, where they're very close to adopting when we arrive on the site, it's pushing them, it's reaching that little bit of tipping point and getting them to adopt, establish a new protected area or adopt a new behaviour.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about what the RARE is sort of going in a more focused direction now,
Yeah.
as far as cohorts
Yeah.
of campaigns?
Sure. Yeah. So in the past, a cohort is like a class. Think of a cohort as a class. We typically have 10 or 12 campaign managers at one time in one class. So whether it's in Bogor or whether it's in China, there's 10 or 12 of them. In the past, we've tended to take campaigns from anywhere. So, for example, if you look at the most recent cohort from the English-speaking program, in the same class, we had Mongolia. I know they're not English-speaking, but the campaign manager spoke English. We have Mongolia, Madagascar, Laos, Fiji, Chuuk, Guam. Now, if you look at a map, these are all over the place on the map. And if you look at the threats they're facing, one is working on overfishing of a fish in a river, another on a gazelle, another one on reef fish, another one on tigers. So you have two problems here. First of all, it's very difficult to teach a cohort like that because you can't focus on a single solution. If I start talking about, well, the solution to tiger poaching is increased enforcement, for example, or let's say banning restaurants from serving the prey of the tiger because people are hunting the tiger's prey to eat, that's not the same solution as somebody working on a fire in the Pacific. Secondly, to monitor those campaigns, because we still visit them twice. It's a hell of a distance from Laos to Fiji,
Yeah.
or from Mongolia to Chuuk. And so what we've decided to do is have what we call thematic cohorts. So all 12 campaign managers in the classroom will be working on broadly the same threat, broadly the same solution, and come from broadly the same geographic area. That means we can tailor the curriculum. We can bring in specialists to talk about if let's say the solution is fuel-efficient stoves. Everybody in that room is going to be working on fuel-efficient stoves. Now, there may be different kinds of fuel-efficient stoves, but there's an economy there of our teaching. Also, if they're all in the Philippines, for example, or all in Indonesia, it makes it a lot easier to monitor them. It doesn't mean you're travelling 1,000,000 miles a year, it means you're travelling a subset of that. So we've moved towards thematic cohorts, and so this year we might work on, for our English-speaking program, we might work on overfishing and locally marine protected areas, whereas in our Latin America cohort we may be focusing on upland deforestation and reciprocal agreements. And so this is where we're moving to. Before, anybody could come to the course, doesn't matter what their threat is, doesn't matter where they are. Now we're saying, well, hang on a second, you might have to wait till next year because we're not working on your theme. And I believe it's a much better approach.
It would appear, just listening to it, it would appear that the impact, as much of an impact as these individual campaigns had, as you said,
Sure.
Somebody's working on tigers and river fish. If a class of 12, the cohort, are all from the Philippines or all from a certain region, and they're all working on the same threat, it would seem that the impact that they would have is going to be just enormous.
One would hope. That's
Yes.
the hope. This is the first year we've run thematic cohorts, so we are not certain of this, but certainly that's the logic. The logic is you can tailor your curriculum, you can focus your visits, you can have, as you said, scale even within a country. So if we're working on a bunch of communities along the same coastline, and here, 5 miles away you've got one campaign, and 30 miles the other way you've got one campaign, one would hope that the impact is multiplied. We'll see. We're going to see. That's what the logic says.
Great.
Rare is nothing but innovative in trying to constantly change its approach and trying to do better and learn. We're not a silver bullet for everything. Pride campaigns are not necessarily going to work in every particular site. And the secret is to find the best site, the best solution, the best campaign manager, and the best lead agency. So it's a bit like cooking a cake. If you have a great kitchen, great ingredients, and a great cook, hey, you're pretty much done. If you have a lousy kitchen and lousy agreements and you have a really good cook, well, maybe you'll end up with something. And so this is not try to find...
Something edible, right?
It could be an omelette, it might not be a cake, but yeah. And so it is hard, and it's not an easy program, and not every campaign is going to be spectacularly successful, but I'm very proud, having seen or been involved in 160 campaigns all over the world in I don't know how many countries. These are my heroes. These campaign managers are nothing short of the best.
That's great. Well, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
For talking. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Paul.
No problem. Is that all right?
That was great.
Good. You can edit it down. And
yeah. If we keep it under, and we're under an hour.
Good.
So that's beautiful.
Okay.
We'll edit it down. And, this is more just like